Unit 731. Hidden away in the plains of Manchuria during the 1930s and 40s, this was a facility where human life had zero value. Known officially as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, its real purpose was the development of biological weapons. Thousands of people, referred to as maruta, or logs, were subjected to horrors that defy logic. Researchers performed vivisections on living subjects, often without any anesthesia. They believed that using numbing agents would alter the results, so victims remained fully conscious as their internal organs were removed one by one. If you were a prisoner there, you might be used for frostbite testing. Guards would take you outside in sub-zero temperatures, repeatedly drenching your arms in water until they froze solid. To test the level of freezing, a doctor would strike your limb with a wooden club. If it made a sound like a piece of dry wood, the test was complete. Then they would attempt to defrost the limb using various methods, often involving scalding water that would cause the skin and muscle to simply slide off the bone. Other experiments involved placing subjects into high-pressure chambers until their internal organs literally burst, or tying people to stakes to test the effectiveness of plague-infested flea bombs and chemical sprayers. There was no escape, and no one ever left Unit 731 alive. The Nazi hypothermia experiments. Conducted at the Dachau concentration camp, these trials were designed to find the best way to treat German pilots who had crashed into the freezing North Sea. If you were a subject in these tests, you would be forced to sit in a tank of ice water for up to 5 hours. Doctors would monitor your rectal temperature as it plummeted. Once your body temperature hit around 25 degrees Celsius, most subjects would lose consciousness or die from cardiac arrest. But for the Nazis, death wasn't the end of the experiment. They wanted to know how to bring you back. They tried active rewarming, which involved throwing the freezing unconscious person into a vat of boiling water, often causing fatal skin blistering and shock. They even tested animal heat, where they would place the freezing victim between two naked women, hoping that the proximity of other bodies would stabilize the temperature. The results were scientifically useless, but the cost was hundreds of lives lost to a slow, agonizing freeze. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. This experiment took place not in a secret bunker, but on American soil in Alabama, lasting for 40 years. It began in 1932 when the U.S. Public Health Service decided to track the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African American men. The 600 men involved were never told they had syphilis. Instead, they were told they were being treated for bad blood. They were offered free meals and burial insurance, but they were denied the very thing they needed: a cure. Even when penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, researchers actively prevented the men from receiving it. They watched as the participants went blind, became paralyzed, suffered from dementia, and eventually died as the bacteria ate away at their cardiovascular and nervous systems. The experiment only ended in 1972 after a whistleblower leaked the story to the press. By then, dozens of men had died, and many of their wives and children had been infected with the disease. Project MKUltra. During the height of the Cold War, the CIA became obsessed with the idea of mind control. They wanted to find a way to break human will and rebuild a person's mind from scratch. For 20 years, they conducted clandestine experiments on unwitting citizens in hospitals, prisons, and universities. If you were a target of MKUltra, you might be given massive, repeated doses of LSD without your knowledge. Some subjects were kept in drug-induced comas while being forced to listen to repetitive audio loops through headphones, a process called psychic driving. The goal was to erase the personality and replace it with a new one that could be controlled. The results were catastrophic. Many participants suffered permanent brain damage, extreme paranoia, and total psychological collapse. One subject was reportedly given LSD for 77 days straight. When the program was eventually exposed, the CIA destroyed most of the records, leaving the full extent of the trauma a mystery. The Monster Study. In 1939, a researcher named Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa wanted to prove that stuttering was a learned behavior rather than a biological one. He chose 22 orphaned children for his experiment. Half of the children were given positive speech therapy, praised for every word they spoke clearly. The other half, however, were subjected to negative therapy. These children, many of whom had no speech problems at all, were constantly belittled and told that they were developing a stutter. If they spoke, they were corrected and mocked. If they hesitated, they were told they were failing. The psychological pressure was so intense that the children who previously spoke fine began to develop deep-seated speech inhibitions. They became withdrawn, refused to speak in class, and developed lifelong psychological scars. They didn't actually become stutterers in the clinical sense, but they were conditioned to believe they were broken, a label that followed them for the rest of their lives. J. Marion Sims and the Origins of Gynecology. Often called the father of modern gynecology, Sims developed surgical techniques that save lives today, but the way he developed them was horrific. In the mid-1800s, Sims performed experimental surgeries on enslaved black women in Alabama. He operated on one woman named Anarcha 30 times without any anesthesia. He believed that black people did not feel pain in the same way white people did, a racist myth used to justify his brutality. These women were forced to undergo repeated invasive procedures while being restrained by other enslaved people. Sims only moved his practice to New York and began using anesthesia once he started treating wealthy white women. The medical breakthroughs were real, but they were built on a foundation of systemic torture and the exploitation of women who had no legal right to say no. The Plutonium Files. During the Manhattan Project and into the Cold War, the U.S. government wanted to know how radioactive materials would affect the human body. To find out, they began injecting unsuspecting patients with plutonium, uranium, and other toxic isotopes. In one case, a man named Albert Stevens went to a hospital thinking he was being treated for stomach cancer. Instead, doctors injected him with a massive dose of plutonium-238. He survived for 20 years, but his bones were slowly being irradiated from the inside out. Other experiments involved feeding radioactive oatmeal to children at a state school, or releasing radioactive iodine into the atmosphere over populated areas to track the fallout. The subjects were often the most vulnerable, the poor, the sick, and the institutionalized. They were never told they were being poisoned. They were simply treated as data points in the race for nuclear supremacy. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. Much like the Tuskegee Study, this was a project run by the U.S. government, but with an even more aggressive approach. From 1946 to 1948, researchers intentionally infected nearly 1,500 Guatemalans, including prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients, with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. They didn't just wait for them to catch it, they used injection or abrasion methods, directly rubbing the bacteria into the subjects' bodies. In some cases, they paid prostitutes who were already infected to have sex with prisoners. The goal was to test the effectiveness of penicillin as a preventative measure. Many of the victims were never treated, and the experiment was kept secret for over 60 decades until a professor discovered the records in 2010. The Aversion Project. In South Africa during the 1970s and 80s, the apartheid-era military sought to cure homosexuality among its conscripts. If a soldier was suspected of being gay, they were sent to Ward 22, a psychiatric unit where they were subjected to chemical castration and massive doses of electric shock therapy. While being shown erotic imagery, patients would be shocked until they lost consciousness. When these methods failed to change their orientation, the military forced many of the victims to undergo gender reassignment surgeries. These procedures were often botched, and the victims were then discharged into a world that no longer recognized them, physically and mentally shattered by a government that viewed their identity as a medical defect. Stateville Malaria Study. During World War II, the U.S. military needed a cure for malaria to protect soldiers fighting in the Pacific. They turned to the Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois. Over 400 inmates were recruited to be bitten by malaria-carrying mosquitoes. While the prisoners consented, the environment of a prison makes true consent impossible. The subjects suffered through high fevers, intense chills, and the debilitating physical toll of the disease, while doctors tested experimental drugs on them. One prisoner died from a heart attack during the trials. Although the media at the time praised the inmates as heroes, the experiments set a dangerous precedent for using incarcerated populations as a cheap and captive resource for high-risk medical research, blurring the lines between rehabilitation and exploitation.